no kwiyubaka ku giti cyacu individuellement. Buri mucikacumu wese uri hano, kandi iyo mvuga umucikacumu kuri njyewe umunyamurenge wese no mucikacumu. Uwapfuye yapfuye urupfu nashoboraga gupfa n'undi yashoboraga gupfa. Umucikacumu wese amenye ko inshingano za mbere dukura muri uku kwibuka nuko twiyubaka ku giti cyacu b'umugabo. Ubwoko buzakomera kuko bufite abakomeye muri bo. Nuba umugabo ku giti cyawe, uzaba uri kumbera umugabo, uzaba uri kunyubaka, uzaba uri kurema ubwoko, uzaba uri kubukura kuri cya cyavu ubwicazanya n'abakomeye. Ariko kandi kwibuka kuzaturememo kwiyubaka collectively nk'ubwoko. Ubutabera dusaba, impamvu butaratugeraho, suko nta kuri dufite, nuko tutaragera ku rwego bagomba kutwubaha babuduhe. Duhaguruke tuba abagabo. Ibyo dukeneye tuzabyihesha. Inshingano z'ubutabera ku bwicanyi bwatubayeho ziturimwo kurusha uko ziri ku isi ku bandi. Ariko kandi n'inshingano zo kurema kazoza ku bana bacu n'abuzukuru bacu, kugira ngo hatagira uwundi uzabaho mu buzima twabayeho. Amarira twarize abana bacu ntibakayarire, abuzukuru bacu ntibakayarire. Ibyo biri mu nshingano zacu, jewe nawe. Ndaza kuvuga mu Cyongereza kubera ko ibyo dufite kubwira isi ni byinshi kuruta ibyo dufite kubwirana. Ariko mu magambo makeya tubanze twumvikane kuri aya magambo, ko uko twibuka dutahe twiremamo imbaraga zo kwiyubaka, kugira ngo ejo tutazirirwa twiruka dusaba, ahubwo ibyo dukeneye bazabidusangisha kubera ko twakomeye twabaye abagabo. Ndavuga bikeya ariko ndabizi ko mwumva cyane. Ikindi ndashaka kubasezeranya ko turi kumwe. Icyadukuye hano kikatujana hariya no kugira ngo tutazongera kurira kuko. No kugira ngo natwe tuzabeho kuko abandi babaho. No kugira ngo isi tikazatwibuke kubera imbabazi kuko ntayigira. No kugira ngo turemera kazoza abadukomokaho. Murakoze cyane, Imana ibahe umugisha. As we commemorate for the 22nd time the Gatumba genocide against the Abanyamurenge that happened in Burundi on the night of the 13th, giving in the 14th of August in 2004. The theme of this year is remembering the victims, defending dignity, demanding justice, and defeating genocidal ideology. We remember not to reopen the door of hatred, but to close the road to repetition. We demand justice, not as a revenge, but as a foundation for long-lasting peace. We use memory as a political and moral duty to all of us. Dear survivors, distinguished guests, today we gather with grief, with reverence, and with determination. 22 years have passed since that night of August 13, 2004, when the Abanyamurenge refugees at Gatumba, who had fled persecution in eastern DRC, were attacked in a camp in which they came seeking safety. 166 of them were killed. More than 100 people were wounded and others disappeared. Women, children, elderly people, entire families were burned and or slaughtered because of who they were. Today, 22 years later, we remember every one of them by name. We refuse to think of them as numbers, as statistics, because every life was a brother, was a sister, was a son, was a mother, was a father. We remember children who never had the opportunity to grow up to their God-given potential. We remember mothers who never returned to their families. We remember fathers whose children waited for them in vain. We remember the elderly whose lives were taken rather than protected. We remember the wounded, we remember the missing, and we remember the survivors who have carried this pain for 22 long years. 22 years means that there is an entire generation that has grown up asking a simple question: when will justice be served? When will justice be done? And our answer today must be very clear and with no ambiguity. Justice must not be abandoned because time has passed. Because time does not erase the crime. Time does not erase the names of the victims. Time does not make the dead less important. And time cannot transform impunity into justice. 22 years are enough. However, let me also be clear on something. We demand justice, not as a revenge, but as a foundation for peace. Justice is accountability. Gatumba must be remembered truthfully. Gatumba was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate act, an attack against a targeted community. The victims were identified and targeted as Abanyamurenge. Testimonies documented threats and slogans against the Abanyamurenge, calling for the Abanyamurenge to be killed and to be prevented from returning to the DRC. United Nations investigations documented the ethnic and political dimensions of the attack. FNL Palpehutu publicly claimed responsibility at a time. How can the principle of presumption of innocence be invoked in circumstances where individuals themselves have publicly acknowledged responsibility for the act in question? Other allegations concerning the support from other armed groups and Mai are yet to receive a full, complete, independent, and credible judicial examination that the survivors and the family deserve. And that is precisely why we continue to call for accountability based on evidence and law. We must be able to say clearly what we know, acknowledge what remains to be established, and demand that the unanswered questions be investigated. For the Abanyamurenge community, Gatumba wears an essential characteristic of a genocidal crime. A community was deliberately identified, dehumanized, and attacked because of its identity, with the apparent and obvious intent to destroy members of that community. We therefore continue to call for the gravity, the intent, the historical meaning of Gatumba to be examined fully and judicially. Gatumba did not begin in Gatumba. My brother Paul Musafiri refused to start his remembrance and his memory on the night of the Gatumba. He researched the mass grave and proceeded to the dignified inhumation for the families to be comforted. In 1996, I couldn't bury my loved ones. I lost my father and my brothers, 3 brothers, in one night, the night of September 22nd, 1996. I did not get a chance to bury them. I still don't know where lays their bones and remains. Allow me to read you just a chapter of my book. I went in December of 1996, trying to see if I can find where they were buried. Once I disembarked from the bus, after 7-hour journey, I searched out and found the building in which the captives had been confined, which even 3 months after the carnage had not been cleaned. I doubt anyone had ever even entered the room. It was like those haunted, forbidden places where no one dares to go. It was dark when I first entered, reeking of death, with a canopy of spider webs draping from the ceiling and the corners. I entered alone. The young man who showed me the room immediately went back as a sign to warn me not to go in, but I had no choice. I had been on the road almost the entire day, hours just for this. The room was quiet, yet beyond the borders of the eerie silence, from somewhere deep within me, as if from a great distance, I could hear the deafening screams of desperate voices, men, old and young, and boys, their soprano voices like sirens of terror in the airspace. In the shadow of my mind, an ancient scripture voiced itself within my mind, almost catatonic with shock and disbelief. I spare you with the scripture. The floor was covered in obscene washes of blood, as were the walls. I watched in my mind involuntarily recreating the brutal savagery of the aftermath I gazed upon, empty of all life, feeling, and I was numb. I did not cry. And although I was there in body, I was absent in spirit, for I simply could not take the full extent of its horror into my being. Blood was everywhere, sticking and smearing over the walls, floors, and doors. Reckless splashes of blood and desperate scarlet handprints, mute evidence of the attempt of the doomed to somehow escape their death chamber. Again, I felt almost marveled at the same curious detachment that had invaded my being since the first learning of my family's fate. I did not get a chance to bury them. The story of Gatumba represents an entire history of people, of a community that started a long time before we existed. To understand why Gatumba remains so important, we must understand that the massacre did not emerge from nowhere. For generations, Abanyamurenge and other Congolese Tutsi communities have faced questions about whether they truly belong in the country of their ancestors. And here it's important to know that Congo became Congo and was given limits and borders after we lived for centuries in what was to become Congo. The question of Abanyamurenge citizenship is not a matter of debate. There are so many legal documents, including the Constitution, that affirm and recognize their status as Congolese citizens by nationality of origin, but this issue has often and repeatedly been used as a political weapon. Communities were described as foreigners. Their belonging was challenged. Their belonging to the Congolese society was challenged. Their political participation was restricted. And I can go on and on. The lesson is that dehumanizing and exclusion create conditions in which violence becomes possible. First, community is told it does not belong. Then its citizenship is questioned. Then its members are described as dangerous, foreigners, criminals, disloyal. Then violence becomes easier to justify. And finally, when victims resist or survive, they can be blamed for the violence committed against them. We have seen this recipe produce the same results over and over, and yet we continue to say never again. Genocide and mass atrocities do not begin when the first bullet is fired. They begin much earlier, when a society is taught to see part of its population as less human. Genocide begins with words, with perceptions. Congolese Tutsi have been described with dehumanizing words, dehumanizing language, including being called snakes, cockroaches, invaders, infiltrators, poison. Such language should never be treated as harmless political rhetoric. Words can identify targets. Words can remove moral restraint. Words can encourage betrayers. And words can make violence look patriotic or necessary. We therefore call upon media institutions, civil societies, governments, diplomatic missions, international organizations, and digital platforms to take systematic hate speech very, very seriously. And let me just say too, Gatumba did not end in Gatumba. The story of Gatumba does not end with the burial of the dead. In the years that followed, Abanyamurenge and other Congolese Tutsi communities continued to experience killings, displacement, looting of their livestock, destruction of their homes and villages, sexual violence, arbitrary detention, and other forms of abuse. From Uvira and Fizi to the Haut Plateau and Minembwe, families have been uprooted, livelihoods destroyed, and civilians placed in situations of profound insecurity. We remember the victims of Gatumba, but we also remember those killed afterwards. We remember those killed in places such as Masisi, Minembwe, Ijambo, Mikenke, Mudende, Kamombo, and elsewhere. We remember those lynched in cities like Goma, Lueba, Kalima. We remember those who were killed while displaced, and those whose names never made it to an international report. Every life has equal dignity. Every victim deserves to be remembered. And every credible allegation of a serious crime deserves to be investigated. We will not answer persecution with hatred. Today, we must also speak honestly about the present. It is true that Abanyamurenge community continue to face serious concerns about discrimination, insecurity, political exclusion, hate speech, and the failure of institutions to provide protection, and equal protection, I meant. And we ask governments and international actors to examine these concerns seriously and independently. But we also must be clear, our accusation is not against an entire people. We do not blame every Congolese person for the crimes committed against the Abanyamurenge. We do not seek the destruction of another community. We do not seek revenge. We seek protection. We seek equality. We seek the right to live as Congolese citizens without having to repeatedly prove that we belong. The dignity we demand for the Abanyamurenge must be the dignity we recognize in every other Congolese community. Justice that produces hatred is not justice. Liberation that humiliates another community is not liberation. And a peaceful Congo cannot be built by replacing one form of collective discrimination by another form of discrimination. That is not what we are asking for. We are asking for justice. And I believe this is not too much asking. 22 years of impunity is too long. 22 years after Gatumba, one of the deepest wounds remains the absence of a complete and credible judicial process. Survivors have carried their memories for 22 years. Families have carried their grief. Evidence has aged. Evidence has aged, but also witnesses have died. And the political calculations have too often prevailed over the demand for justice. This cannot continue indefinitely. Although these crimes are not subject to a statute of limitation, justice should not be delayed indefinitely. It would be deeply, deeply unjust for those responsible for the Gatumba massacre to die of natural causes without ever being held accountable for their actions. What we ask of the international community, to the United Nations, the African Union, the European Union, the East African Community, the governments of the Great Lake regions, the international judicial institutions, human rights organizations, and all those committed to preventing mass atrocities do not allow protection of minority to become negotiable because defending them is politically inconvenient. I will repeat this. Do not allow the protection of the minority to become negotiable because defending them is politically inconvenient. Do not condemn hate speech in principle while ignoring it when it becomes politically useful. To the government of the United States, we recognize and appreciate your strong engagement in search for peace in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We welcome the diplomatic efforts represented by the Washington Accords and the Doha peace process. We also recognize that the United States possesses significant diplomatic influence when it's used in fairness and in neutral and impartial way. That is why we call upon the US government to use its diplomatic leverage to assure that the pursuit of peace does not come to the expense of justice. A lasting peace cannot be built by asking victims to forget while the perpetrators remain beyond the reach of the law. We ask for three few things: the truth be told, justice be served, and protection be guaranteed. To our survivors, families, and youth, your wounds have not been forgotten, your courage has not been invisible. Your loved ones belong to our collective memory. We know we cannot bring them back, but we can refuse to allow their names to disappear. Learn this history, preserve it accurately, study it, teach it, but carry it without hatred. Let memory give you discipline, education, unity, and service, not revenge. Do not allow our suffering to become an inheritance of hatred. Let it become an inheritance of responsibility. We also recognize that peace is not sustainable by goodwill alone. It requires the capacity to defend life and dignity. No community can remain permanently vulnerable and expect lasting safety. The responsibility to protect our people, our rights, and our future is the essential foundation of any durable peace. And to our brothers and sisters in Minembwe and elsewhere throughout the diaspora, remain united, protect the vulnerable, reject division that weaken our ability to defend life and pursue justice. And to all Congolese who reject ethnic hatred, the struggle is also yours. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, by Martin Luther King Jr. When you are a man or a woman of value, like my brother Paul Musafiri, you recognize the pain of one community, like the one we are describing today of the Abanyamurenge, is a wound in the conscience of the entire Congolese nation. If citizenship can be taken from one community, another community will become vulnerable tomorrow. If ethnic hatred is tolerated against one group, it eventually weakens the protection of all. Let us therefore build a Congo where diversity is protected by law, where diversity is seen as a strength, not as a source of division, where political disagreement does not become ethnic persecution. From remembrance to responsibility, as we mark the 22nd commemoration of Gatumba, we do more than mourning. We remind ourselves that we will remember the 166 victims as people, not as numbers. We will defend the truth against denial. We will pursue justice through evidence and law. We will protect life and dignity when institutions fail. We will demand a political order in which security is guaranteed by rights rather than purchased through permanent fear. We will refuse to allow our pain to turn in against the humanity of others. We will not disappear. We will not surrender our identity. We will not apologize for our existence, but neither will we surrender our humanity to hatred. May the memory of the victims strengthen our courage. May the resilience of the survivors guide our conscience. May the truth of Gatumba be preserved. May justice finally reach those who have waited 22 long years and may the people of Minembwe and all community of Eastern Congo one day live in a peace secured not by fear, but by rights, by accountability, by equal citizenship, and by the rule of law. God bless all the survivors, the families of the victims, and God bless all those who labor for peace and justice all around the world. Thank you.